Medieval painting, from the beginning of the Christian era to the Renaissance. The Middle Ages extend from the latter part of the 5th century to the time of the Renaissance, or about the 15th century. The painting of this period has little to attract attention if regarded only from an artistic standpoint, for we may truly say that, comparing it with the Greek art which had preceded it, or with the Italian art which followed it, that of the Middle Ages had no claim to the beautiful. On the other hand, it is full of interest to students because it has its part in the history of art. Therefore, I shall give a mere outline of it, so that this link in the chain which unites ancient and modern painting may not be entirely wanting in our book. This period is called the early period of the Middle Ages, and the pictures are often called the works of early Christian art. Early medieval painting, down to about AD 950, consists principally of paintings in burial places, mosaics, usually in churches, and of miniatures, or the illustration and illumination of MSS, which were the books of that time and were almost without exception religious writings. About 1050, a revival of intellectual pursuits began in some parts of Europe, and from that time it may be said that the Renaissance, or new birth of art and letters, was in its ABCs, or very smallest beginnings. The period between 950 and 1250 is often called the Central or Romanesque period of the Middle Ages, and it was during this time that glass painting originated. It is one of the most interesting features of art in medieval times. From 1250 to 1400 comes the final or Gothic period of the Middle Ages, and this has some very interesting features which foretell the coming glory of the Great Renaissance. The early period. The paintings of the catacombs date from the 3rd and 4th centuries after Christ. The catacombs, or burial places of the early Christians, consist of long, narrow, subterranean passages, cut with regularity and crossing each other like streets in a city. The graves are in the sides of these passages, and there are some larger rooms or chambers into which the narrow passages run. There are about 60 of the catacombs in and near Rome. They are generally called by the name of some saint who is buried in them. The paintings are in the chambers, of which there are sometimes several quite near each other. The reason for their being in these underground places was that Christians were so persecuted under the Romans that they were obliged to do secretly all that they did as Christians, so that no attention should be attracted to them. The principal characteristics of these pictures are a simple majesty and earnestness of effect. Perhaps spirituality is the word to use, for by these paintings the early Christians desired to express their belief in the religion of Christ and especially in the immortality of the soul, which was a very precious doctrine to them. The catacombs of Rome were more numerous and important than those of any other city. Many of the paintings in the catacombs had a symbolic meaning beyond the plainer intention which appeared at the first sight of them. You will know what I mean when I say that not only was this picture of Moses striking the rock intended to represent an historical fact in the life of Moses, but the flowing water was also regarded as a type of the blessing of Christian baptism. The walls of the chambers of the catacombs are laid out in such a manner as to have the effect of decorated apartments, just as was done in the pagan tombs, and sometimes the pictures were a strange union of pagan and Christian devices. The above cut, from the catacomb of S. Domitilla, has in the center the pagan god Orpheus playing his lyre, while in the alternate compartments of the border are the following Christian subjects. 1. David with the sling. 2. Moses striking the rock. 3. Daniel in the lion's den. 4. The raising of Lazarus. The other small divisions have pictures of sacrificial animals. These two cuts will give you an idea of the catacomb wall paintings. The mosaics of the Middle Ages were of a purely ornamental character down to the time of Constantine. Then, when the protection of a Christian emperor enabled the Christians to express themselves without fear, the doctrines of the Church and the stories of the life of Christ and the histories of the saints, as well as many other instructive religious subjects, were made in mosaics and placed in prominent places in churches and basilicas. Mosaics are very durable, and many belonging to the early Christian era still remain. The mosaics at Ravenna form the most connected series and are the best preserved of those that still exist. While it is true in a certain sense that Rome was always the art center of Italy, it is also true that at Ravenna, the works of art have not suffered from devastation and restoration as have those of Rome. After the invasion of the Visigoths in AD 404, Honorius transferred the imperial court to Ravenna, and that city then became distinguished for its learning and art. The Ravenna mosaics are so numerous that I shall only speak of one series, from which I give an illustration. This mosaic is in the church of San Vitalis, which was built between AD 526 and 547. In the dome of the church there is a grand representation of Christ enthroned. Below him are the sacred rivers of paradise. Near him are two angels and San Vitalis, to whom the Savior is presenting a crown. Bishop Ecclesias, the founder of the church, is also represented nearby with a model of the church in his hand. On a lower wall there are two pictures in which the Emperor Justinian and the Empress Theodosia are represented. Our cut is from one of these, and shows the Emperor and Empress in magnificent costumes, each followed by a train of attendants. This emperor never visited Ravenna, but he sent such rich gifts to this church that he and his wife are represented as its donors. After the time of Justinian, AD 527 to 565, mosaics began to be less artistic, and those of the later time degenerated, as did everything else during the Middle or Dark Ages, and at last all works of art show less and less of the Greek or classic influence. When we use the word miniature as an art term, it does not mean simply a small picture as it does in ordinary conversation. It means the pictures executed by the hand of an illuminator or miniator of manuscripts, and he is so called from the minium or cinnabar which he used in making colors. In the days of antiquity, as I have told you in speaking of Egypt, it was customary to illustrate manuscripts, and during the Middle Ages, this art was very extensively practiced. Many monks spent their whole lives in illuminating religious books, and in Constantinople and other eastern cities, this art reached a high degree of perfection. Some manuscripts have simple borders and colored initial letters only. Sometimes, but a single color is used and is generally red, from which comes our word rubric, which means any writing or printing in red ink, and is derived from the Latin rubrum, or red. This was the origin of illumination or miniature painting, which went on from one step to another until, at its highest state, most beautiful pictures were painted in manuscripts in which rich colors were used on gold or silver backgrounds, and the effect of the whole was as rich and ornamental as it is possible to imagine. Many of these old manuscripts are seen in museums, libraries, and various collections. They are very precious and costly, as well as interesting. Their study is fascinating, for almost every one of the numberless designs that are used in them has its own symbolic meaning. The most ancient artistic miniatures of which we know are those on a manuscript of a part of the Book of Genesis. It is in the Imperial Library at Vienna and was made at the end of the 5th century. In the same collection, there is a very extraordinary manuscript, from which I give an illustration. This manuscript is a treatise on botany and was written by Dioscorides for his pupil, the Princess Juliana Anicia, a granddaughter of the Emperor Valentine III. As this princess died at Constantinople, AD 527, this manuscript dates from the beginning of the 6th century. This picture from it represents Dioscorides dressed in white robes and seated in a chair of gold. Before him stands a woman in a gold tunic and scarlet mantle, who represents the genius of discovery. She presents the legendary mandrake root, or mandragora, to the learned man, while between them is the dog that has pulled the root and falls dead, according to the fabulous story. This manuscript was painted by a masterly hand and is curious and interesting. The plants, snakes, birds, and insects must have been painted from nature, and the whole is most skillfully done. During the Middle Ages, the arts, as practiced in Rome, were carried into all the different countries in which the Romans made conquests or sent their monks and missionaries to establish churches, convents, and schools. Thus, the medieval arts were practiced in Gaul, Spain, Germany, and Great Britain. No wall paintings or mosaics remain from the early German or Celtic peoples, but their illuminated manuscripts are very numerous. Miniature painting was extensively done in Ireland, and many Irish manuscripts remain in the collections of Great Britain. When Charlemagne became the king of the Franks in 768, there was little knowledge of any art among his northern subjects. In 800, he made himself emperor of the Romans also, and when the Franks saw all the splendor of Rome and other parts of Italy, it was not difficult for the great emperor to introduce the arts into the Frankish portion of his empire. All sorts of beautiful objects were carried from Italy by the Franks, and great workshops were established at Aix-la-Chapelle, the capital, and were placed under the care of Eginhard, who was skilled in bronze casting, modeling, and other arts. He was called Bezaleel, after the builder of the tabernacle. We have many accounts of the wall paintings and mosaics of the Franks, but there are no remains of them that can be identified with positive accuracy. Miniature painting flourished under the rule of Charlemagne and his family, and reached a point of great magnificence and effect, though it was never as artistic as the work of the Italian miniatures. And indeed, gradually everything connected with art was declining in all parts of the world. And as we study its history, we can understand why the terms Dark Ages and Middle Ages are used to denote the same epoch, remarkable as it is for the decay and extinction of so many beautiful things. During the Romanesque period, 950–1250 architecture was pursued according to laws which had grown out of the achievements and experiences of earlier ages, and had reached such a perfection as entitled it to the rank of a noble art. But this was not true of painting, which was then but little more than the painting of the Egyptians had been, that is, a sort of picture writing, which was principally used to illustrate the doctrines of religion, and by this means to teach them to peoples who had no books, and could not have read them had they existed. During all this time, the art of painting was largely under the control of the priests. Some artists were priests themselves, and those who were not were under the direction of some church dignitary. Popes, bishops, abbots, and so on were the principal patrons of art, and they suggested to the artists the subjects to be painted, and then the pictures were used for the decoration of churches and other buildings used by the religious orders. The monks were largely occupied in miniature painting. Artists frequented the monasteries, and indeed, when they were engaged upon religious subjects, they were frequently under the same discipline as that of the monks themselves. Next to the influence of the church came that of the court, but in a way it was much the same, for the clergy had great influence at court, and although painting was used to serve the luxury of sovereigns and nobles, it was also true that these high personages often employed artists to decorate chapels and to paint altarpieces for churches at their expense, for during the Romanesque period there was some painting on panels. At first, these panel pictures were placed on the front of the altar where draperies had formerly been used. Later, they were raised above the altar and also put in various parts of the church. The painting of the Romanesque period was merely a decline, and there can be little more said of it than is told by that one word. Glass painting dates from this time, the very earliest specimens of which we know are from the 11th century. Before that time, there had been transparent mosaics made by putting together bits of colored glass and arranging them in simple, set, and ornamental patterns. Such mosaics date from the earliest days of Christianity and were in use as soon as glass was used for windows. From ancient writings, we know that some windows were made with pictures upon them as long ago as AD 989, but nothing now remains from that remote date. There is a doubt as to whether glass painting originated in France or Germany. Some French authors ascribe its invention to Germany, while some German writers accord the same honor to France. Remains of glass painting of the 11th century have been found in both these countries, but it is probable that 5 windows in the Cathedral of Augsburg date from 1065 and are a little older than any others of which we know. This picture of David is from one of them, and is probably as old as any painted window in existence. The oldest glass painting in France is probably a single fragment in the Cathedral of Le Mans. This cathedral was completed in 1093, but was badly burned in 1136, so that but a single piece of its windows remains. This has been inserted in a new window in the choir and is thus preserved. With the beginning of the 12th century, glass painting became more frequent in Europe, and near the end of this century it was introduced into England, together with the Gothic style of architecture. Very soon, a highly decorative effect was given to glass painting, and the designs upon many windows were very much like those used in the miniatures of the same time. The stained glass in the Cathedral of St. Denis, near Paris, is very important. It dates from about 1140 to 1151 and was executed under the care of the famous Abbot Suger. He employed both French and German workmen and decorated the entire length of the walls with painted windows. St. Denis was the first French cathedral in the full Gothic style of architecture. The present windows in St. Denis can scarcely be said to be the original ones, as the cathedral has suffered much from revolutions, but some of them have been restored as nearly as possible, and our illustration will give you a good idea of what its windows were. The stripes which run across the ground in this window are red and blue, and the leaf border is in a light tone of color. There are 9 medallions. The 3 upper ones have simply ornamental designs upon them, and the 6 lower ones have pictures of sacred subjects. The one given here is an Annunciation, in which the Abbot Suger kneels at the feet of the Virgin Mary. His figure interferes with the border of the medallion in a very unusual manner. Perhaps the most important ancient glass painting remaining in France is that of the west front of the Cathedral of Chartres. It dates from about 1125, when this front was begun. There are 3 windows, and their color is far superior to the glass of a later period, which is in the same cathedral. The earliest painted glass in England dates from about 1180. Some of the windows in Canterbury Cathedral correspond to those in the Cathedral of St. Denis. In the Strasbourg Cathedral, there are some splendid remains of painted glass of the Romanesque period, although they were much injured by the bombardment of 1870. Figure is from one of the west windows and represents King Henry I. This is an unusually fine example of the style of the period before the more elaborate Gothic manner had arisen. The quiet regularity of the drapery and the dignified air of the whole figure is very impressive. An entirely different sort of colored windows was used in the churches and edifices which belonged to the Cistercian order of monks. The rule of this order was severe, and while they wished to soften the light within their churches, they believed it to be wrong to use anything which denoted pomp or splendor in the decoration of the house of God. For these reasons, they invented what is called the grisaille glass. It is painted in regular patterns in gray tones of color. Sometimes these windows are varied by a leaf pattern in shades of green and brown, with occasional touches of bright color, but this is used very sparingly. Some of these grisaille windows are seen in France, but the finest are in Germany in the Cathedral of Heiligenkreuz. They date from the first half of the 13th century. The Gothic order of architecture, which was perfected during this period, had a decided influence upon the painting and sculpture of the time, but this influence was not felt until Gothic architecture had reached a high point in its development. France was now the leading country of the world, and Paris came to be the most important of all cities. It was the center from which went forth edicts as to the customs of society, the laws of dress and conduct, and even of the art of love. From France came the codes of chivalry, and the Crusades, which spread to other lands, originated there. Thus, for the time, Paris overshadowed Rome and the older centers of art, industry, and science, with a worldwide influence. Although the painting of this period had largely the same characteristics as that of the Romanesque period, it had a different spirit, and it was no longer under the control of the clergy. Before this time, too, painters had frequently been skilled in other arts. Now it became the custom for them to be painters only. And besides this, they were divided into certain classes of painters, and were then associated with other craftsmen who were engaged in the trade which was connected with their art. That is, the glass painters painted glass only, and were associated with the glass blowers, those who decorated shields with the shield or scutcheon makers, and so on, while the painters, pure and simple, worked at wall painting and a little later at panel painting also. From this association of artists and tradesmen, there grew up brotherhoods which supported their members in all difficulties and stood by each other like friends. Each brotherhood had its altar in some church. They had their funerals and festivals in common, and from these brotherhoods grew up the more powerful societies which were called guilds. These guilds became powerful organizations. They had definite rights and duties, and even judicial authority as to such matters as belonged to their special trades. All this led to much greater individuality among artists than had ever existed before. It came to be understood that a painter could, and had a right to, paint a picture as he wished, and was not governed by any priestly law. Religious subjects were still painted more frequently than others, and the decoration of religious edifices was the chief employment of the artists, but they worked with more independence of thought and spirit. The painters studied more from nature, and though the change was very slow, it is still true that a certain softness of effect, an easy flow of drapery, and a new grace of pose did appear, and about a cut d. 1350, a new idea of the uses and aims of painting influenced artists everywhere. About that time, they attempted to represent distances and to create different planes in their works, to reproduce such things as they represented far more exactly than they had done before, and to put them in just relations to surrounding places and objects. In a word, they seemed to awake to an appreciation of the true office of painting and to its infinite possibilities. During this Gothic period, some of the most exquisite manuscripts were made in France and Germany, and they are now the choicest treasures of their kind in various European collections. Figure of the Birth of the Virgin Mary is from one of the most splendid books of the time, which was painted for the Duc de Berry and called the Great Book of the Hours. The wealth of ornament in the border is a characteristic of the French miniatures of the time. The Germans used a simpler style, as you'll see by Figure of the Annunciation. The influence of the Gothic order of architecture upon glass painting was very pronounced. Under this order, the windows became much more important than they had been, and it was not unusual to see a series of windows painted in such pictures as illustrated the whole teaching of the doctrines of the Church. It was at this time that the custom arose of donating memorial windows to religious edifices. Sometimes they were the gift of a person or a family, and the portraits of the donors were painted in the lower part of the window, and usually in a kneeling posture. At other times, windows were given by guilds, and it is very odd to see craftsmen of various sorts at work in a cathedral window. Such pictures exist at Chartres, Bourges, Amiens, and other places. About AD 1300, it began to be the custom to represent architectural effects upon colored windows. Our cut is from a window at Königsfelden, and will show exactly what I mean, this figure-painted window. This style of decoration was not as effective as the earlier ones had been, and indeed, from about this time glass painting became less satisfactory than before, from the fact that it had more resemblance to panel painting, and so lost a part of the individuality which had belonged to it. Wall paintings were rare in the Gothic period, for its architecture left no good spaces where the pictures could be placed, and so the interior painting of the churches was almost entirely confined to borders and decorative patterns scattered here and there and used with great effect. In Germany and England, wall painting was more used for the decoration of castles, halls, chambers, and chapels, but as a whole mural painting was of little importance at this time in comparison with its earlier days. About AD 1350 panel pictures began to be more numerous, and from this time there are vague accounts of schools of painting at Prague and Cologne, and a few remnants exist, which prove that such works were executed in France and Flanders. But I shall pass over what is often called the transitional period, by which we mean the time in which new influences were beginning to act, and hereafter I will tell our story by giving accounts of the lives of separate painters. For from about the middle of the 13th century, it is possible to trace the history of painting through the study of individual artists. Giovanni Cimabue, the first painter of whom I shall tell you, was born in Florence in 1240. He is sometimes called the father of modern painting, because he was the first who restored that art to any degree of the beauty to which it had attained before the Dark Ages. The Cimabue were a noble family, and Giovanni was allowed to follow his own taste and became a painter. He was also skilled in mosaic work, and during the last years of his life held the office of Master of the Mosaic Workers in the Cathedral of Pisa, where some of his own mosaics still remain. Of his wall paintings, I shall say nothing except to tell you that the finest are in the upper church at Assisi, where one sees the first step in the development of the art of Tuscany. But I wish to tell the story of one of his panel pictures, which is very interesting. It is now in the Rucellai Chapel of the Church of Santa Maria Novella in Florence, and it is only just in me to say that if one of my readers walked through that church and did not know about this picture, it is doubtful if he would stop to look at it. Certainly he would not admire it. The story is that when Cimabue was about 30 years old, he was busy in painting this picture of the Madonna enthroned, and he would not allow anyone to see what he was doing. It happened, however, that Charles of Anjou, being on his way to Naples, stopped in Florence, where the nobles did everything in their power for his entertainment. Among other places, they took him to the studio of Cimabue, who uncovered his picture for the first time. Many persons then flocked to see it, and were so loud in their joyful expressions of admiration for it, that the part of the city in which the studio was has since been called the Borgo Allegri, or the Joyous Quarter. When the picture was completed, the day was celebrated as a festival. A procession was formed, bands of music played joyful airs. The magistrates of Florence honored the occasion with their presence, and the picture was borne in triumph to the church. Cimabue must have been very happy at this great appreciation of his art, and from that time he was famous in all Italy. Another Madonna by this master is in the Academy of Florence, and one attributed to him is in the Louvre in Paris. Cimabue died about 1302 and was buried in the Church of Santa Maria del Fiore, or the Cathedral of Florence. Above his tomb, these words were inscribed: Cimabue thought himself master of the field of painting. While living, he was so. Now he holds his place among the stars of heaven. Other artists who were important in this early time of the revival of painting were Andrea Tafi, a mosaicist of Florence, Margheritone of Arezzo, Guido of Siena, and of the same city Duccio, the son of Buoninsegna. This last painter flourished from 1282 to 1320. His altarpiece for the Cathedral of Siena was also carried to its place in solemn procession, with the sound of trumpet, drum, and bell. Giotto di Bondone was the next artist in whom we have an unusual interest. He was born at Del Colle, in the commune of Vespignano, probably about 1266, though the date is usually given 10 years later. One of the best reasons for calling Cimabue the father of painting is that he acted the part of a father to Giotto, who proved to be so great an artist that from his time painting made a rapid advance. The story is that one day when Cimabue rode in the valley of Vespignano, he saw a shepherd boy who was drawing a portrait of one of his sheep on a flat rock, by means of a pointed bit of slate for a pencil. The sketch was so good that Cimabue offered to take the boy to Florence and teach him to paint. The boy's father consented, and henceforth the little Giotto lived with Cimabue, who instructed him in painting and put him to study letters under Brunetto Latini, who was also the teacher of the great poet Dante. The picture which we give here is from the earliest work by Giotto, of which we have any knowledge. In it were the portraits of Dante, Latini, and several others. This picture was painted on a wall of the Podesta at Florence, and when Dante was exiled from that city, his portrait was covered with whitewash. In 1841, it was restored to the light, having been hidden for centuries. It is a precious memento of the friendship between the great artist and the divine poet, who expressed his admiration of Giotto in these lines. In painting, Cimabue fain had thought to lord the field, now Giotto has the cry, so that the other's fame and shade is brought. Giotto did much work in Florence. He also, about 1300, executed frescoes in the lower church at Assisi. From 1303 to 1306, he painted his beautiful pictures in the Cappella dell'Arena at Padua, by which the genius of Giotto is now most fully shown. He worked at Rimini also, and about 1330 was employed by King Robert of Naples, who conferred many honors upon him and made him a member of his own household. In 1334, Giotto was made the chief master of the cathedral works in Florence, as well as of the city fortifications and all architectural undertakings by the city authorities. He held this high position but 3 years, as he died on January 8, 1337. Giotto was also a great architect, as is well known from his tower in Florence, for which he made all the designs and a part of the working models, while some of the sculptures and reliefs upon it prove that he was skilled in modeling and carving. He worked in mosaics also, and the famous Navicella, in the vestibule of St. Peter's at Rome, was originally made by him, but has now been so much restored that it is doubtful if any part of what remains was done by Giotto's hands. The works of Giotto are too numerous to be mentioned here, and his merits as an artist too important to be discussed in our limits, but his advance in painting was so great that he deserved the great compliment of Cennino, who said that Giotto had done or translated the art of painting from Greek into Latin. I shall, however, tell you of one excellent thing that he did, which was to make the representation of the crucifix far more refined and Christ-like than it had ever been. Before his time, every effort had been made to picture physical agony alone. Giotto gave a gentle face, full of suffering, it is true, but also expressive of tenderness and resignation, and it would not be easy to paint a better crucifix than those of this master. In person, Giotto was so ugly that his admirers made jokes about it, but he was witty and attractive in conversation, and so modest that his friends were always glad to praise him while he lived, and since his death his fame has been cherished by all who have written of him. There are many anecdotes told of Giotto. One is that on a very hot day in Naples, King Robert said to the painter, "Giotto, if I were you, I would leave work and rest." Giotto quickly replied, "So would I, sire, if I were you." When the same king asked him to paint a picture which would represent his kingdom, Giotto drew an ass bearing a saddle on which were a crown and scepter, while at the feet of the ass there was a new saddle with a shining new crown and scepter, at which the ass was eagerly smelling. By this he intended to show that the Neapolitans were so fickle that they were always looking for a new king. There is a story which has been often repeated which says that in order to paint his crucifixes so well, he persuaded a man to be bound to a cross for an hour as a model, and when he had him there, he stabbed him, in order to see such agony as he wished to paint. When the Pope saw the picture, he was so pleased with it that he wished to have it for his own chapel. Then Giotto confessed what he had done, and showed the body of the dead man. The Pope was so angry that he threatened the painter with the same death, upon which Giotto brushed the picture over so that it seemed to be destroyed. Then the Pope so regretted the loss of the crucifix that he promised to pardon Giotto if he would paint him another as good. Giotto exacted the promise in writing, and then, with a wet sponge, removed the wash he had used, and the picture was as good as before. According to tradition, all famous crucifixes were drawn from this picture ever after. When Boniface VIII sent a messenger to invite Giotto to Rome, the messenger asked Giotto to show him something of the art which had made him so famous. Giotto, with a pencil, by a single motion drew so perfect a circle that it was thought to be a miracle, and this gave rise to a proverb still much used in Italy, più tondo che l'O di Giotto, or rounder than the O of Giotto. Giotto had a wife and 8 children, of whom nothing is known but that his son Francesco became a painter. Giotto died in 1337 and was buried with great honors in the church of Santa Maria del Fiore. Lorenzo de' Medici erected a monument to his memory. The pupils and followers of Giotto were very numerous and were called Giotteschi. Among these, Taddeo Gaddi and his son Agnolo are most famous. Others were Masso and Bernardo di Dado, but I shall not speak in detail of these artists. While Giotto was making the art of Florence famous, there was an artist in Siena who raised the school of that city to a place of great honor. This was Simone Martini, who lived from 1283 to 1344, and is often called Simone Memmi because he married a sister of another painter, Lippo Memmi. The most important works of Simone, which remain, are at Siena in the Palazzo Pubblico and in the Lower Church at Assisi. There is one beautiful work of his in the Royal Institution at Liverpool, which illustrates the text, "Behold, thy father and I have sought thee, sorrowing." While the papal court was at Avignon in 1338, Simone removed to that city. Here he became the friend of Petrarch and of Laura, and has been praised by this poet as Giotto was by Dante. Another eminent Florentine artist was Andrea Orcagna, as he is called, though his real name was Andrea Arcagnuolo di Cione. He was born about 1329 and died about 1368. It has long been the custom to attribute to Orcagna some of the most important frescoes in the Campo Santo at Pisa, but it is so doubtful whether he worked there that I shall not speak of them. His father was a goldsmith, and Orcagna first studied his father's craft. He was also an architect, sculptor, mosaicist, and poet, as well as a painter. He made an advance in color and in the painting of atmosphere that gives him high rank as a painter. As a sculptor, his tabernacle in the church of Or San Michele speaks his praise. Mr. C.C. Perkins thus describes it. Built of white marble in the Gothic style, enriched with every kind of ornament, and storied with bas-reliefs illustrative of the Madonna's history from her birth to her death, it rises in stately beauty toward the roof of the church, and, whether considered from an architectural, sculptural, or symbolic point of view, must excite the warmest admiration in all who can appreciate the perfect unity of conception through which its bas-reliefs, statuettes, busts, intaglios, mosaics, and incrustations of Pietre d'Or, gilded glass, and enamels are welded into a unique whole. But perhaps it is as an architect that Orcagna is most interesting to us, for he it was who made the designs for the Loggia de Lanzi in Florence. This was built as a place for public assembly and the discussion of the topics of the day in rainy weather. It received its name on account of its nearness to the German guardhouse, which was called that of the Landsknechts in German, or Lanzi, as it was given in Italian. Orcagna probably died before the loggia was completed, and his brother Bernardo succeeded him as architect of the commune. This loggia is one of the most interesting places in Florence, fully in sight of the Palazzo Signoria near the Gallery of the Uffizi, and itself the storehouse of precious works of sculpture. There were also in these early days of the 14th century schools of art at Bologna and Modena, but we know so little of them in detail that I shall not attempt to give any account of them here, but will pass to the early artists who may be said to belong to the true Renaissance in Italy.